Hey guys, tonight we plunge deep into the mucky, moldy, occasionally mint-scented world of medieval hygiene. You're surrounded by flickering torchlight, the shuffle of leather boots on stone, and the faint smell of boiled rosemary. A wooden door creaks open ahead of you, revealing clouds of steam rolling out like fog from a cauldron. Welcome to a medieval bathhouse equal parts spa, social hub, and bacteria breeding ground. Just watch your step. That puddle might be lye, or yesterday's stew, or worse. Oh, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push through the low wooden archway, ducking instinctively as damp steam envelops your face. The air smells of time, sweat, and aging wood. Inside, the bathhouse buzzes with voices. In one corner, a man hums while shaving with a knife the size of your forearm. In another, two women are debating loudly whether adding sage to the hot tub will ward off toothaches or marriage proposals. You lower yourself into a bench carved straight from the wall and try not to look directly at the water. It's cloudy. Yes. Warm. Definitely. And possibly shared by half the village. Bathhouses in medieval Europe weren't just about staying clean. They were about staying human, at least socially. Think of them as the medieval Starbucks. Minus the espresso, and plus a lot of naked peasants. You'd bathe, gossip, conduct business, and maybe catch a minor fungal infection. But that's part of the charm. These places were surprisingly common in towns across Europe, especially during the earlier Middle Ages. When cleanliness was still vaguely fashionable, bathhouses could be privately owned, municipal, or run by monasteries. They were often gender-segregated, but not always, which led to predictable awkwardness and occasional scandals. Historians still argue whether mixed bathing was more about moral decay or just a really awkward way to make friends. Your bath attendant, a boy no older than 12, with a ragged tunic and an expression of existential regret, offers you a bucket of scalding water. You take it with trembling hands and pour it into the shared tub. That smell. It's chamomile and something distinctly goat-like. The herbs were a common addition, both for their supposed healing properties and to mask the bouquet of the human condition. Soap. You ask, well, not always. Some people used soap made from animal fat and ashes, which could peel paint off a door. Others preferred strigils, curved metal scrapers borrowed from the Romans. You'd oil yourself up, then scrape the grime off like a well-basted chicken. It wasn't relaxing, but it got the job done. Ish. But this watery haven wouldn't last forever. As the centuries rolled on, public bathhouses gained a reputation for being a little too steamy in more ways than one. By the late Middle Ages, with the rise of syphilis and the belief that warm water opened the pores to disease, many bathhouses were shuttered. Cleanliness was out, caution, paranoia, and dry sponging were in. You dry yourself with a sheet that feels more like bark and get dressed beside a pile of gently steaming towels that will definitely never be laundered. And then there's the holy irony monasteries. These supposedly austere, pious places often had the best hygiene practices around. Monks were required to bathe weekly, sometimes even more if they were fancy monks. They had access to heated water, soap, and even a schedule of communal bathing. That said, you try praying while your neighbor loudly exfoliates with a stone. There's a curious tale you hear, while sipping a weak ale in the changing room, that in some towns, people believed disease came from bad smells, miasma rather than germs. So they'd perfume the bathhouse air with burning herbs or citrus peels. It made everything smell vaguely like spicy compost. But hey, they were trying. As you step back out into the evening fog, wrapped in layers and still vaguely damp, you wonder how anyone in medieval Europe ever felt truly clean. Bathhouses were a momentary solution, a hot breath of civilization in an otherwise itchy world. But even that luxury faded with time. Still, it's not all bad. You did get to sit in warm water for the first time in months, and your hair no longer crunches when touched. For now, that's a win. You wake up the next morning, stiff from the wooden cot, and mildly suspicious of the straw poking your back. Breakfast is a chunk of bread that tastes like yesterday's bathwater. But you chew it dutifully and head outside, clutching your leather pouch of personal hygiene tools. And by tools, you mean a rag, a stick, and hope. You find a quiet spot near a trough. Horses drink from it sometimes. But it's the closest thing to a mirror you're going to get. You squat and begin the delicate ritual of tooth care. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, just a thin twig, frayed at one end, which you've chewed down to bristles. You scrape gently at your molars, the bark leaving little slivers in your gums. Minty freshness. Not quite. You might get a whisper of fennel or sage if you're lucky. But mostly, it tastes like stick. Toothpicks made from wood, bone, or even metal were common enough. And some wealthier folks used cloth dipped in salt, ashes, or crushed herbs to rub their teeth clean. Some even mixed charcoal with honey or vinegar to make a crude paste. Sounds terrible. And it was, but at least it wasn't poison. Well, not always. There's a fringe report from a 13th century manuscript suggesting some noblewomen tried powdered brick for whitening. Effective. Possibly. Tooth-shattering. Absolutely. Historians still argue whether daily dental care was routine or reserved for special occasions. Some evidence points to good dental health among certain medieval populations, likely due to less sugar and more fiber in the diet. Others argue that chronic bad breath and blackened teeth were practically a medieval love language. You splash some cold water on your face again, from the same trough, and wince. It's icy. You remember hearing that noblewomen might rinse their mouths with wine or rosewater in the morning. Seems classy, until you realize that wine was doing most of the heavy lifting, and rosewater was just fancy camouflage for fermented goat cheese breath. You head back into the alley behind the inn, where laundry flaps like surrender flags, and someone's boots have been steaming in the sun for 3 days straight. There, you use a little cloth soaked in rosemary water to wipe your face and neck. Cloth washing was rare. Most people spot cleaned themselves and reused linen strips until they developed their own personalities. You overhear two ladies talking near a barrel of rainwater. They're arguing over whether rubbing sage leaves on armpits counts as bathing. One claims it wards off evil spirits. The other just likes the smell. You quietly raise your arm and wonder whether you, too, have offended a spirit or two lately. Deodorant, in the modern sense, didn't exist. But that didn't stop people from trying. Crushed herbs, lavender sachets sewn into clothing, and even a medieval pit paste made from lard and alum powder were used to mask odor. You once heard a particularly wealthy merchant imported cinnamon oil just for his armpits. He died young, but he died fragrant. Back indoors, your host offers you a small tin of tooth powder. Clearly proud of it. You pop the lid and find a grayish dust that smells like ashes and mint, made from burned bread crusts, salt, and herbs. It was one of the better options. The tin even has a tiny brush, a luxury, and for a fleeting second, you feel like royalty. Your gums bleed slightly after the scrub. But that's considered normal. Medieval folk expected some blood. After all, everything else was bleeding noses, feet, social boundaries. One particularly strange theory of the time claimed that spitting often helped maintain oral health, so spittoons were as common as spoons. As for dental procedures, well, you pray it never comes to that. There were tooth drawers, not dentists. You'd be sat on a stool, handed a wooden cross to bite down on, and the tooth was yanked out with pliers or a hook. Sometimes in a tavern, sometimes in a public square. Either way, you were probably better off just dealing with the toothache and screaming into a pillow. A moldy one. There's a village tale about a friar who cured toothaches by whispering Latin into a mug of beer and having the patient drink it while hopping on one foot. The practice didn't catch on, probably because beer was too valuable to waste on dental voodoo. Despite all this, you meet a merchant whose teeth are pristine, almost suspiciously so. He attributes it to chewing cloves every night and avoiding love letters, which you assume is slang for sweets. You thank him and promptly stuff 2 cloves in your cheek, only to discover they taste like peppery bark. It's midday now, and you're trying not to talk too much because your mouth feels like a chimney. But hey, you've survived another morning in the medieval world without losing a molar or being accused of witchcraft for brushing your teeth too enthusiastically. That's a win in your grimy little ledger. You lean back against a wall, the sun warming the stone behind you, and think about how much effort goes into staying even remotely clean. Hygiene, here, isn't about vanity, it's about survival, social currency, and avoiding being the smelly one in a room full of smelly ones. And tomorrow, you get to do it all over again. With your faithful twig, your herbal rag, and your questionable tin of miracle powder. You decide to explore the castle today because nothing says hygiene adventure like creeping through a place designed for drafty grandeur and draftier plumbing. The moment you step inside the stone corridor, your nose wrinkles. It's a blend of damp stone, wax, smoke, and something vaguely beefy. A servant rushes past with a bucket, sloshing something brownish, and you wisely choose not to ask. If you've ever wondered what royal hygiene smells like, the answer is disappointment and wet dog. You climb the spiral staircase, worn smooth from centuries of armored footsteps, and reach the grand hall. It's beautiful, sure, Tapestries line the walls. Sunlight filters through stained glass, and gilded candelabras sparkle like they haven't been touched by greasy fingers. But beneath all that royal charm is the underlying stench of unwashed nobility. That fur-trimmed cloak never cleaned. Those velvet cushions, harboring secrets from 3 generations of butts. Castles weren't just fortresses, they were also pretty terrible at waste management. Most had garderobes, which is just a fancy word for hole in the wall, leading to a pit of doom. You peek inside one, a narrow stone seat built over a shaft, often draining down to the moat or into cesspits that occasionally overflowed during rain. Hope you're not squeamish, because even the moat meant to deter invaders doubled as an open sewer. Romance. You pass a maid carrying a tray of lavender petals, which she's about to sprinkle around the bedchambers. Not for decoration, mind you, but to mask the smell of people. There's a belief among the castle elite that if you surround yourself with flowers and pleasant scents, the bad air won't kill you. Historians still argue whether this miasma theory ever helped or just made everyone smell like scented rot. There's a strange little alcove tucked behind the banquet hall where the queen's attendants mix rosewater, powdered clove, and a bit of ground coral. It's part of the court's cleaning ritual, really more perfuming than purifying. You're handed a cloth dabbed in the mixture, and your skin tingles as you pat it on your face. Better than nothing. But still a long way from soap and running water. You slip into the royal bedchamber. Careful not to scuff. The rushes dried grasses, herbs, and flowers spread across the floor to absorb moisture and filth. Every now and then, they're replaced, though now and then varies from household to household. You lift a corner and reveal crumbs, beetle husks, and something that may have once been a pear. You gently lower it again. Washing basins are tucked near the windows, but no plumbing here. Servants bring warm water by the pitcher, and the basin is emptied into slop buckets that may or may not make it outside before dark. You take a moment to appreciate how important servants were not just for luxury, but for basic survival. Without them, the royal family would be stewing in its own extravagance and sweat. Fun fact, Queen Isabella of Castile supposedly bragged about only bathing twice in her life. Whether that's apocryphal or a misunderstood flex is still up for debate. What we do know is that bathing among the upper class declined during the late Middle Ages, partly due to fears of illness, partly due to the rise of linen undergarments, which were believed to absorb sweat and keep the body clean. So instead of bathing, the royals changed clothes, often, layering clean linens under outer garments. A fresh chemise meant fresh skin, or so the logic went. Of course, that didn't stop lice, fleas, or any of the hundreds of bacteria setting up shop beneath those brocade doublets. You enter the king's solar, a cozy chamber meant for reading and writing. Here, the king sits in a robe that hasn't seen soap in months, dictating a letter while a servant rubs his feet with scented oil, not because he's pampered, but because foot rot is real. And if he's going to lead a campaign next week, he needs his toes in one piece. You're invited to sit by the hearth and sample castle water, a mix of herbs steeped in wine, used to clean the face and sometimes the hands. It stings your eyes and tastes like regret. But you nod politely. Hygiene here isn't just about status. It is status. The more herbal your scent, the more respected your position. A tiny dog with its own velvet pillow sneezes beside you. You offer it some of the rosewater cloth, and it sneezes again. Even royal pets are only marginally cleaner than the servants scrubbing chamber pots downstairs. By the time you leave the castle, your nose has adjusted, but your clothes have not. You smell like lavender, vetvol, and a hint of old bread. Still, you've seen the height of medieval luxury, and it mostly involves outsourcing your filth to someone else. As you descend the hill back to town, you remember the bucket from earlier? You pass the servant again, and this time, he's emptying its contents into a ditch behind the castle walls. Sanitation. Medieval style. Throw it where the wind takes it and hope it doesn't blow back. You veer off the cobblestone road and head toward the outskirts of town, where the roofs sag. Chickens roam freely, and the air smells less like incense and more like turnips and tragedy. This is where the peasants live, farmers, laborers, and people who bathe somewhere between, rarely, and didn't know that was an option. Hygiene out here. It's more a suggestion than a standard. You pass a small cottage with smoke curling from the chimney and a pig asleep beside the front door. Inside, a family is beginning their day. The mother stirs a pot of something beige. The children rub the sleep from their eyes, and the father is trying to untangle straw from his beard. Their hygiene routine, if you can call it that, begins and ends with a splash of cold water from a wooden bucket by the door. Tooth care, a finger, and a prayer. The floor is hard-packed dirt, though someone has thoughtfully sprinkled it with rushes to keep it clean. You step carefully over a chicken who does not move, even when nudged. The family's laundry hangs on a line strung across the room. Shirts, underclothes, and a pair of hose that look like they've seen battle. They're washed about once a month, maybe twice in summer, if the creek hasn't dried up, and when they are washed, it's often in cold, soapy water made from lye, wood ash, and sheer willpower. Water itself is precious and not always trusted. Many villagers believe that bathing too often weakens the body or opens it up to illness. Historians still argue whether this belief came from actual observations of sickness following cold baths or from pure medieval myth-making. Either way, peasants weren't dunking themselves daily in fresh spring water, most simply wiped down with a damp cloth. If that, you join one of the older daughters as she sets out to clean the floor. Her cleaning solution, a mixture of leftover ale, vinegar, and thyme. The room smells like a salad gone wrong, but she insists it keeps the fleas away. She scrubs with a worn brush, and you can see the patches where the wood beneath has been permanently stained by generations of muddy boots, spilled gruel, and livestock accidents. You ask where the family bathes, and she points to a barrel outside. When it rains, it fills. When it doesn't, well, she shrugs. The barrel is half full now, covered with a plank to keep out leaves and curious squirrels. When bath day comes, which is often reserved for holidays or the night before a festival, everyone uses the same water, eldest to youngest. By the end, the liquid resembles soup more than sanitation. Inside, you notice a small pot of dried herbs on the mantel. It's a blend of lavender, rosemary, and something that smells faintly like oregano. It's not for seasoning, it's for rubbing on the skin to mask odor and, allegedly, Repel demons. One child swears it also keeps lice away. But the scratching on his scalp tells a different story. Speaking of lice, oh yes, they're a regular part of life. You sit near the hearth as the eldest son slowly combs through his brother's hair with a fine-toothed iron comb. The ritual is calm, almost meditative. Every time the comb snags, he stops, pinches, and flicks something into the fire. You pretend not to notice. Clothing is a different flavor of dirty. Most peasants owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, an outer tunic and maybe a cleanish shift underneath. These were rarely washed fully. Instead, they were aired out, beaten with sticks, or sprinkled with herbs to freshen them. You try not to laugh when someone suggests hanging clothes near a pigsty helps mask human odor. Honestly, they might be right. The privy is a hole behind the shed, screened by a few boards and the mercy of tall weeds. It's shared by the family, and occasionally the neighbor's dog. Toilet paper, forget it. You're lucky if there's a mossy rock nearby. Some more resourceful households keep a cloth on a stick washed. Eventually, the irony, of course, is that many of these peasants were healthier than their noble counterparts when it came to exposure, living outdoors, eating coarse bread and simple stews, and not wearing 17 layers of wool kept them hardy, if not fragrant. Still, you can't shake the smell of onions, wood smoke, and damp wool that follows you out of the cottage like an affectionate ghost. One old woman proudly tells you she brushes her teeth with salt and chews parsley every morning. Her teeth are yellow but intact. She attributes her health to garlic and good bread, which, honestly, might be the most scientific thing you've heard all day. You spend the afternoon helping fetch water from a nearby stream, watching as a girl filters it through a rag before pouring it into the cooking pot. Cleanliness here isn't about soap, it's about practicality, about making do, and about trying to keep the chickens out of your wash bucket. As the sun sets, you settle onto a bench outside, the air thick with wood smoke and frying cabbage. Your skin itches from the dust. Your clothes have picked up new and horrifying scents, and you're not entirely sure that thing in your boot was moss. But there's a kind of honesty to it, gritty, itchy, slightly damp honesty. And somehow, you find yourself admiring how these people survive it all, with a shrug, a comb, and a dash of vinegar. You rise early with the bells of the monastery chiming somewhere in the mist. A slow, droning echo that vibrates through your bones. Your feet crunch on dew-covered gravel as you approach a stone complex that smells faintly of candle wax and old books. A sleepy monk in a robe, 2 sizes, too big, waves you inside without a word, already holding a broom in one hand and a clay pot in the other. Welcome to monastic hygiene, equal parts discipline, humility, and damp wool. Inside, the cloisters are silent, but not still. The monks move about like ghosts, sweeping, hauling water, or scrubbing walls with thick, bristled brushes. You follow one through a series of arched corridors to the lavatorium, a kind of communal washroom that smells surprisingly fresh. Long stone basins run along the walls, fed by a slow-moving channel of water cold. Always, but cleaner than most village wells. The monk hands you a square of linen and nods toward the basin. You wash your hands, copying the practiced movements of the others around you, There's no soap here, just sand or ash to scrub with, depending on the day. The sensation is gritty, mildly painful, and incredibly effective. You scrub until your knuckles shine like old porcelain, and your fingernails, remember, they once had a color other than peasant stew brown. Monasteries, especially the well-funded ones, often had better hygiene facilities than castles or towns. The rule of Saint Benedict even prescribed regular washing of both hands and bodies, though regular meant weekly, or more often during hot weather. Not luxurious, but better than nothing. Historians still argue whether this was for cleanliness or spiritual symbolism. But either way, it involved water, which already puts monks ahead of most people. After washing, you head to the latrines. They're surprisingly organized long rows of holes, carved into stone benches, with water channels underneath to carry waste away. You don't ask where the channels go. You sit awkwardly on a cool slab and contemplate your life choices. At least there's airflow. The latrines are built near the river and cleverly positioned to allow waste to flow out with the current. A small triumph of medieval engineering. Unless you happen to live downstream. You wonder briefly if anyone's ever tried to fish near here, then decide never to eat fish again. Later, do you watch as a monk shaves another's head with a straight razor? It's part of maintaining the tonsure, the iconic bald spot that looks like a reverse yarmulke. Keeping the scalp clean was important not only for appearance, but also for avoiding lice, which still managed to sneak their way into even the most sanctified of hoods. You're shown the shelves where robes hang spare habits, washed once every couple of weeks in large vats. Stirred with sticks and left to dry in the sun. They're rough, scratchy things that chafe your shoulders, but at least they're not caked in grease or rat hair. One monk invites you to assist with the brewing of a herbal rinse lavender, marjoram, and vinegar, heated gently over coals. They'll use it to rinse feet later during a ritual washing, a practice observed before major religious days. You sniff the mixture and cough. It smells like a salad in a thunderstorm. Still, it's better than feet left to marinate for weeks. You notice that monks don't wear shoes indoors. Just leather sandals or sometimes nothing at all. This wasn't only symbolic humility, it helped air out the feet and reduced the risk of rot. Especially important when communal life meant sharing every square inch of space. As you help stack firewood near the bathhouse, a monk tells you in hushed tones that their small order still bathes monthly, sometimes more often in summer. Their bathhouse is simple, a low stone room with a wooden tub and a fire-heated copper kettle. You peek inside. It's dim, warm, and smells of wet wood and thyme. The water is reused, of course, and each monk bathes quickly. In order of seniority, baths weren't about indulgence. Here they were about order, humility, and taking care of the vessel that housed the soul. You sit quietly by the doorway and watch steam rise in little ribbons toward the ceiling. The monk next to you hums a psalm as he scrubs his arms with a linen cloth and a surprising amount of determination. One older monk tells you of a legend, likely exaggerated, where a particularly holy brother refused to bathe for 20 years and was said to emit the scent of lilies. You lean closer and catch a whiff of something floral, and then realize he's just carrying dried petals in his robes. You're invited to the refectory for a meal: simple bread, cheese, and broth. Before entering, everyone washes their hands again at the lavatorium. No exceptions. There's a kind of sacred rhythm to the day prayer. Work. Wash. Repeat. It's not glamorous, but it's cleaner than any tavern you've visited so far. By the end of the day, your skin is raw, your robe itches, and you've been damp in at least 5 separate ways. But you also feel, oddly, calmer. Like cleanliness isn't just a matter of water and soap, but of purpose, of choosing to scrub away the chaos, even if the fleas always come back, and they do come back. You flick one off your collar as you step outside, watching the last bit of sunlight catch on the wet stone path. Behind you, the bells toll again, calling the monks to evening prayer. You leave them to their rituals and their vinegar foot baths, slightly cleaner than before, and a whole lot itchier. You wander back toward the heart of town, passing crooked cottages and half-awake shopkeepers sweeping doorways with more dust than purpose. As you walk, something tickles your nose, a sweet, spicy aroma you haven't smelled in days. It leads you to a merchant's stall, draped in silk scarves and tiny perfume bottles, their cork stoppers slick with residue. A noblewoman is leaning in, dabbing her wrist with something that smells like crushed violets and mystery. You? Filthy from a day, among monks and barrel baths. Keep a respectful distance, but your curiosity that leans in hard. Perfume was more than a luxury in medieval life. It was defense against stink, status, anxiety, and bad humors. While nobles avoided bathing during much of the later Middle Ages for fear it would open their pores to disease, they doubled down on masking their natural scent with elaborate concoctions. You spot a tiny bottle labeled water of roses, and another simply marked musk, which may or may not have come from a deer's gland. You sniff and immediately regret it. Sweet meets swamp. The woman next to you fans herself with a lace fan while powdering her décolletage with crushed pearls and talc. Yes, real pearls. Because if you can't actually be clean, you can at least sparkle like a freshly waxed candlestick. Historians still argue whether this obsession with perfuming was an aesthetic arms race or a legitimate belief in scent. As health, the miasma theory again, where bad smells equaled disease, and nice smells kept you safe. You head into a wealthy home for a closer look at the rituals. In the lady's chamber, the servants are busy preparing her toilette. One brushes her long hair carefully, 100 strokes, while another warms a cloth in rosewater to dab under her arms. The hairbrush is made of ivory and boar bristle. The cloth is linen, embroidered, and changed daily. Meanwhile, you remember wiping your face this morning with what was probably last week's sock. Powder is everywhere on the table, in the air, in your lungs. Face powder, foot powder, even powder to keep undergarments smelling vaguely of lavender instead of last night's venison. One maid is sprinkling a paste made of orris root onto a pair of stockings, muttering that it keeps moths and unwelcome itches away. You do not ask for clarification. In the corner sits a carved wooden box filled with scented cones, burnable perfumes made from herbs and gums. They're lit during dressing to fill the room with pleasant smoke. Think of it as medieval incense. Or maybe a prototype Yankee candle, named "Please Don't Smell Me." The effect is both overwhelming and vaguely mystical. You cough quietly and back away from the fragrant fog. Men weren't exempt from the ritual either. You follow a young nobleman into his chamber as he prepares for court. His valet lays out oils, civet, ambergris, rosemary. The young man bathes only his hands and face with warmed wine and vinegar, then perfumes his sleeves and the inside of his cloak. Why the inside? Because that's where the real stink lives. And no one wants their armpits announcing their arrival. Interestingly, some nobles carried pomanders, tiny scented balls attached to belts or necklaces. Inside were herbs, spices, even bits of sponge soaked in floral oil. One man you pass by is wearing his like a badge of honor. He explains that it keeps the air pure around him, and maybe also masks the fact that he hasn't bathed since Pentecost. You come across a book of beauty recipes, written in a fine hand, with instructions like, take 3 drops of honey, mix with rose oil, and apply to the cheeks with a soft feather. There's also a recipe for a hair rinse made of boiled nettles and rainwater collected under a waxing moon. You're pretty sure someone made that up after one too many meads. Perfume wasn't just external. Mouthwashes made of mint, clove, and wine were common among the rich, more for breath than dental health. One courtier claims it also helps her sing better, though judging by her hoarse cough, you suspect the wine is doing the heavy lifting. And yet, beneath all the effort, all the rosewater and ground coral and exotic oils from the East, there's a quiet desperation. No one wants to smell like themselves. Everyone's fighting against the slow creep of decay, the faint whiff of mortality that clings to even the richest robe. It's not just about allure, it's survival, social or otherwise. By mid-afternoon, you're doused in no fewer than 3 accidental perfumes, 2 medicinal tinctures, and what might be powdered turtle shell. Your head aches from the fumes. Your sleeves are sticky, and you smell like an apothecary got into a bar fight with a bakery. Still, people smile at you. They don't recoil. You've joined the perfumed elite, and your aroma now grants you access to rooms you wouldn't have dared enter yesterday. But as you pass by a servant mopping wine off a marble floor, you catch a faint smell of sweat and earth, and honestly, after a day of olfactory warfare, it's oddly comforting. You breathe in once more, then sneeze 3 times in a row, and a maid gently offers you a silk handkerchief that smells like cinnamon and mystery. You find yourself high in a crumbling tower, squatting uncomfortably over a stone slab with a suspicious hole carved right through it. Beneath you, a sheer drop into the abyss, or, more accurately, the castle's cesspit. Congratulations. You've discovered the glamorous world of medieval toilets, also known as garderobes. And yes, they're just as medieval as they sound. The term garderobe literally means guarding the robes, which might sound elegant until you realize people often hung their clothing near the shaft because the ammonia fumes killed lice. Clever. Absolutely. Hygienic. Only if you consider marinating your trousers in sewer gas a beauty treatment. The hole beneath you opens onto a chute that, depending on the castle's engineering, might deposit waste into the moat. A cesspit. Or just down the outside wall. You try not to imagine what happens on windy days. A wooden cover might be placed over the opening, but it's still chilly, drafty, and smells like yesterday's soup and 400 years of poor decisions. You shuffle sideways down a narrow corridor to find another garderobe tucked into the thickness of the castle wall. A cleaver design. Really privacy. Gravity-powered plumbing. And built-in pest control. If you count rats as roommates. Some castles even had multiple levels of garderobes, stacked vertically, so that one chute could theoretically serve multiple floors. The result? A medieval poo skyscraper. Historians still argue whether this was innovation or just vertical laziness. You make your way to a manor house to compare, and sure enough, their version is little more than a wooden seat over a box. Some more ambitious households installed indoor chamber pots, which were emptied by servants into ditches, cesspits, or occasionally hurled out the window with a shout of garde à l'eau, a warning to unlucky passers-by that a medieval flush was incoming. The chamber pots themselves varied by class. Nobles used ones made of pewter, copper, or even ceramic, often decorated with floral motifs or witty phrases. You glance at one with a painted daisy on the side and hope it's not ironic. Peasants used simple wooden buckets or dug shallow latrines behind their homes. No frills. Just you, the earth, and a deep sense of vulnerability. Toilet paper didn't exist. Of course, you're handed a square of moss by a helpful steward, who also suggests leaves, straf, or, if you're feeling fancy, a handful of sheep's wool. The moss is cold, but surprisingly gentle. You make a mental note to never complain about two-ply again. Later, you observe a servant scrubbing a garderobe bench with vinegar and hot water. It's the closest thing to sanitation you've seen all day. Lime was sometimes sprinkled in pits to reduce the smell and slow decay. And some castles even employed gong farmers, brave souls who manually emptied cesspits under the cover of night. They were paid well, but even their own dogs avoided them. One curious footnote: there were occasional attempts at scented toilet experiences. In a few wealthy homes, herbs like mint or sage were crushed and scattered inside the chamber to improve the aroma. One scribe even wrote of a countess who requested perfumed petals in her privy until she discovered they attracted bees. That experiment ended quickly. You're guided next to a monastery's latrine block, neater, more orderly. Here, the monks line up quietly, performing their ablutions with solemn dignity. A stone channel runs beneath their feet, carrying away waste with a steady trickle of water. It's perhaps the most civilized toilet setup you've seen yet. Though the lack of privacy might make modern visitors cringe, modesty wasn't quite the same priority back then. Outside town, you stumble upon a small village with a communal latrine. It's just a dug trench with wooden planks across the top. Women go early in the morning, men later in the evening, children whenever nature calls. There's no schedule, just necessity. A mother stands nearby, holding a bucket of wash water, ready to clean her toddler's bottom with a cloth and some lukewarm rainwater. It's intimate, practical, and free of ceremony. As the day wears on, you spot a cart being wheeled through town, loaded with waste from chamber pots and latrines. Its driver, cheerful, despite the stench, waves as he passes. This is night soil, valuable fertilizer for nearby farms. What leaves one household as waste might end up growing next season's carrots. Life in medieval times was nothing if not cyclical. You reflect on how something so basic, where you relieve yourself, reveals so much about a society's structure, technology, and comfort. whether squatting in a field, balancing over a moat, or sitting politely atop a pot painted with violets. Every class had to deal with the same bodily reality. Some just did it with more embroidery. As you retreat to your lodging that evening, you find a small ceramic chamber pot tucked discreetly under your straw-filled bed. You stare at it for a moment. It has a chip on one edge and smells faintly of lavender and vinegar. You smile. It's not exactly plumbing. But after today's tour of the toilets of yore, it might just be the height of luxury. The morning is fog-thick and quiet, disturbed only by the distant clop of hooves and the occasional squawk of a disgruntled goose. You're headed into the heart of town, where a foul wind drifts between leaning timber houses and the market stalls that huddle together like gossiping hens. The year doesn't matter. The smell, absolutely unforgettable. You wrinkle your nose as you pass a heap of animal skins, a butcher scraping his blade, and someone emptying a chamber pot from a second-story window with all the grace of a sneeze. This is public health, medieval style, or at least the earliest glimmers of it. The town is bustling, but underneath the surface activity is a growing anxiety, the fear of sickness, contagion, and death. Especially when the rats start showing up in broad daylight and someone begins humming the plague rhyme before noon. You walk past a street sweeper, a real profession. Though sweeping is generous. He's pushing refuse and straw into a shallow gutter that runs alongside the road, hoping the next rain will carry it away. It won't. But the effort counts. There's a half-hearted attempt at keeping the streets clean, mostly enforced by town ordinances that no one reads and fewer obey. Then you see it, a red X hastily painted on the door of a boarded-up house. A sprig of herbs hangs beside it. That's not decoration. It's a warning. Someone inside has fallen ill, and this house has been quarantined. You stop, instinctively holding your breath, even though it's far too late for that. This, you realize, is what happens when hygiene isn't personal. It's collective, and it's collapsing. During outbreaks like the Black Death, whole neighborhoods were sealed, goods burned, and the sick left to die behind closed doors. Towns tried everything, some rational, some laughably not. Doctors in long robes stuffed herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth into their beak masks. Some even walked around whipping the air, as if bad smells could be punished into leaving. Historians still argue whether miasma theory helped or hindered public hygiene efforts. While it led to better air circulation and the planting of fragrant gardens, it also ignored the rats, fleas, and bacteria doing the real damage. So instead of removing the problem, people mostly just made their towns smell like overripe potpourri. You step into a guild hall where city officials are debating new health laws. One scribe proposes moving butchers outside city walls. Another suggests building public latrines. A third wants to ban bathing entirely, convinced it weakens the body's natural defenses. It's a miracle they agree on anything. But slowly, painfully, cities start introducing waste removal services, street cleaning, and basic rules like don't fling feces into the town well. Some towns took it further. In London, for example, rakers were hired to remove waste from cesspits and carry it outside the walls. In Paris, laws required tanners and dyers to dump their noxious waste downstream, away from where people drew water. It wasn't perfect, but it showed that someone, somewhere, was trying. A bell rings. You follow the sound and spot a cart rumbling down the street. A man in a cloak walks ahead of it, ringing the bell and shouting, "Bring out your dead, you freeze." This is plague time. And suddenly the world feels very small. You step aside as townsfolk carry bodies wrapped in cloth, placing them gently into the cart. Some weep. Others stare blankly. Everyone watches the cart roll away toward the burial pits just beyond the town gates. You stumble toward a nearby apothecary. The pungent aroma of rosemary, garlic, and vinegar slapping you awake. Inside, shelves are packed with jars labeled thieves' vinegar, plague water, and wormwood tonic. The apothecary hands you a clove-stuffed pouch and recommends tying it around your neck. You do, if only for the illusion of control. Outside, a group of children skip rope and chant something unsettling about death coming on a rat's tail. You wonder how many of them have already seen more burials than birthdays. Still, amid the fear, there are pockets of progress. You pass a nunnery, where women tend to the sick, washing them with cloths soaked in diluted wine, cleaning linens, and burning straw mattresses after each use. It's rudimentary, but it's care. It's hygiene, born from compassion rather than fear. Back in the market square, the perfume sellers have been replaced by vinegar vendors and talisman hawkers. You buy a small tin of plague balm that smells like regret and pine sap. Will it work? Probably not. But it joins the long list of medieval strategies fueled more by hope than science. As the sun dips and the bells toll for evening prayer, you walk the now quiet streets. The gutters glisten with runoff, and the city smells faintly less terrible thanks to a recent rain and a cartload of herbal ash dumped across the main thoroughfare. You pass a baker sprinkling sage near her threshold, not because it bakes well, but because she believes it keeps the breath of sickness from entering her home. Tonight, you'll sleep in a small room above a tavern. Its walls thin, its mattress lumpy, and its one window open wide to let in clean air. You've washed your hands 5 times today, each time with a different herb. You've worn garlic like a necklace and nearly gagged on posy vinegar. And somehow, you still don't feel clean. But maybe that's medieval hygiene in a nutshell. Not about feeling clean, just feeling like you're doing something. Even if it means stuffing a pouch with rosemary and hoping death walks right past your door. The sun crests lazily over the thatched rooftops as you make your way to the village's washing site, a wide bend in the river, where women are already elbow-deep in sudsy water, slapping linens against rocks like they owe them money. Laundry day has arrived, and it's not the cozy, lavender-scented event you might picture. It's loud, cold, laborious, and judging by the look on one girl's face, intensely personal. You squat beside a wooden tub that's seen better centuries, dipping your hands into the frigid water. Your fingers go numb instantly. One of the older women eyes you skeptically, then hands you a lump of brown soap made from animal fat and ash. It smells faintly of bacon and despair, but you nod in thanks and start scrubbing. Medieval laundry wasn't a daily or even weekly ritual. Clothes were washed when they couldn't be ignored any longer, when the grime became visible, when the smell began to attract company, or when a holy day demanded decency. Linen undergarments were the priority since they sat closest to the skin. Outer garments, especially wool, were brushed, aired, or simply beaten into submission with sticks. You wring out a shirt that might have started life white, but has graduated to medieval beige. A girl next to you laughs and says hers was blue once. Maybe. They don't always bother with dyes unless it's festival season or the shirt belongs to someone important enough to justify the effort. The river itself isn't exactly pristine. It's downstream from several households, a tanner's shop, and if your nose isn't lying, a few dead fish, but it's what's available. And if you boil it first or pray hard enough, it gets the job done. You see a few pots of water, heating over open fires, ready for the second round of rinsing. Clothes dunked in hot water are more likely to come out with fewer lingering life forms. Historians still argue whether medieval folks fully understood the importance of boiling laundry for sanitation, or if it was just a convenient way to remove stubborn stains. Either way, you watch as shirts bubble in pots big enough to cook a peasant and marvel at the steam rising like holy incense. A particularly enthusiastic woman demonstrates how she uses a paddle to beat clothes clean. With every thwack, a plume of water explodes skyward, soaking everyone within a 6-foot radius. She grins through crooked teeth and declares it more satisfying than confession. Nearby, a child is carefully brushing a cloak with stiff bristles dipped in vinegar. His mother insists this keeps away fleas and moths. You try not to ask how often that cloak gets washed. From its smell, you suspect it's enjoying its first bath in a few harvests. Once the clothes are rinsed, they're spread across bushes, fences, and even the backs of livestock to dry. Sheep make excellent laundry racks if they don't wander off with your chemise. You help pin a tunic to a line with wooden pegs, only for the wind to catch it and flap it into your face. The fabric's still damp and smells faintly of thyme, and last winter, you're offered a chance to try starching a process involving boiled wheat or bean water to stiffen collars and sleeves. A noble trickle-down trend. It's mostly reserved for Sunday best garments. The result? A shirt so stiff it could stand on its own and possibly apply for a job. You press your hand against it and feel oddly impressed. Not comfortable, but very vertical. Someone pulls out a small tub of lye, a stronger cleansing agent made from wood, ash, and rainwater. It's powerful stuff, capable of turning even the dirtiest tunic into something vaguely respectable. But it also burns if used carelessly. One girl shows you the red patches on her knuckles from last week's overly ambitious scrubbing. She says it's the price of purity. You hand her a salve made from pig fat and chamomile, which earns you a rare smile as the laundry flaps in the breeze. You help gather kindling for the drying fires. It's not just about warmth, it speeds up drying and discourages insects. Plus, the smoke adds its own rustic touch to the clothes. So everyone walks around smelling like a bonfire for the next few days. One curious local claims her family uses urine. Yes, real urine as a laundry pre-treatment. You blink. She explains, with all the sincerity of a nun, that it helps lift stains and softens fabric. Cold morning water is for cowards. She adds proudly. You politely decline her offer to try the magic tub. By midday, your arms ache, your fingers are raw, and you've developed a newfound respect for linen. But the camaraderie is real. The women joke, share gossip, and occasionally burst into songs about lice. Husbands, or both. There's rhythm to its scrub. Slap. Rinse. Wring. You're part of the cycle now. literally elbow-deep in medieval cleanliness. As the clothes dry, someone waves a sprig of rosemary over them, murmuring a blessing, not just to scent them, but to keep away evil spirits, especially the kind that bring boils and bad luck. Hygiene, here, isn't just a chore. It's ritual, it's community, and it's survival, stitched into every seam. By evening, you carry a damp bundle of freshish laundry back to your lodging. Your shirt smells marginally better. Your socks have regained their shape. And your skin itches in 5 new places. Still, it's the cleanest you've felt in days, maybe even weeks. You collapse onto your straw bed, holding the starched collar of your tunic like a trophy. Tomorrow, it might rain, and everything will go back to mud and mildew. But tonight, your laundry is dry. Your hands are blistered. And you, my friend, are officially part of the cleanest crowd in town. Your scalp itches. Again, it's the 3rd time this hour. And no matter how many times you casually run your fingers through your hair, the sensation returns persistent, maddening, and unmistakable. Welcome to the medieval lice experience. Now, with extra scratching and minimal shame, you duck into a shadowy corner of a stable, trying to avoid the judging stares of passing townsfolk. Though you suspect they're all dealing with the same problem, they just scratch with more dignity. Hair in the Middle Ages is more than a fashion statement. It's a full-time pest control challenge. You glance around and spot a noblewoman adjusting her silk veil. Her hair is braided so tightly it might be holding in her secrets. Head coverings weren't just for modesty. They were the front line in the war against lice, fleas, and general unpleasantness. Covering your head kept your hair a little cleaner, a little safer, and a little less of a 5-star inn for insects. You spot a monk nearby with a gleaming bald pate. It's not just for piety. Tonsure, shaving the crown of the head, was partially about cleanliness. 2. Less hair, fewer bugs. Historians still argue whether this was by design or divine accident. But either way, the shine is practical and kind of stylish. If you squint, you sit beside a young servant girl who's carefully parting her sister's hair with a bone comb. She's hunting for lice, squishing them between her fingernails with a satisfying pop. You pretend you didn't hear that. The combing process is long and oddly intimate, performed in silence, except for the occasional sigh or muttered curse. You're handed a comb and invited to help. Within minutes, you're elbows deep in someone else's scalp and questioning all your life choices. Hair was washed rarely, sometimes once a month, sometimes only for major festivals. Instead, people relied on combing, braiding, and the occasional sprinkling of powdered herbs, lavender, rosemary, or even crushed fennel to mask the odor and discourage bugs. Wealthier folks might use rosewater or vinegar as a rinse. Poorer families may do with rainwater and hope you try out a rinse prepared by a local herbalist mint. Nettle, and a splash of old beer. It smells like a salad bar having an identity crisis. But it tingles pleasantly on your scalp. It's poured slowly from a jug, and you tilt your head back, eyes closed. As the cold liquid soaks through your hair, you imagine the lice fleeing like tiny bandits. There's even a superstition about burying your comb under the doorstep to keep lice from returning. You don't know if it works, but you definitely see a few suspicious lumps in the dirt outside one household. You consider doing the same, just in case. Wigs weren't especially popular in the medieval period. But hair extensions, yes. Really made of horsehair or even human hair were used for special occasions. Women would braid these into their own hair and decorate them with ribbons, beads, and sometimes entire birds. But that was a fashion risk most peasants didn't dare take. You've seen what birds do when startled. Beards, meanwhile, were a different hygiene frontier. Some were trimmed neatly. Others grew wild and crumb-laden. A blacksmith proudly shows off his beeswax beard balm, which he claims keeps the hair soft and the vermin confused. You nod politely and keep your distance. You pass a group of children singing a rhyme about nitpicking literally while taking turns, inspecting one another's scalps. It's communal grooming. And while it's itchy business, it's also a kind of bonding. You're reminded of monkeys at the zoo. Except these kids are far more enthusiastic and only slightly better dressed. One noble you meet insists that regular hair care is essential to personal dignity. He has a servant brush his hair every morning with a silver comb and apply a paste of crushed rosemary and eggs. His hair is shiny. Yes, but the smell haunts your dreams. You try not to breathe too deeply when he speaks. For those who didn't want to deal with hair at all, head shaving was a viable, if extreme solution. Some nuns, monks, and the truly desperate resorted to it during lice outbreaks. You consider it for a brief moment before remembering how cold medieval nights can get. At market, do you stumble upon a merchant selling miracle lice balm, made of pig fat, garlic, and mystery spices? He offers a demonstration, rubbing it into his own scalp and boldly proclaiming himself vermin-free since Pentecost. A nearby dog starts sneezing and runs away. You decide to pass. Interestingly, people believed lice were more attracted to the lazy or sinful. It wasn't just a parasite, it was a judgment. Being infested could bring shame, especially among the upper class. Of course, reality didn't care about status. Even kings scratched behind their ears now and then. By evening, you've tried the rinse, used the comb, and still feel a phantom itch dancing across your scalp. You tie a kerchief around your head, like a true medieval professional, and try not to think about what might be nesting just above your left ear. You lie back on your lumpy mattress, hair slightly damp, smelling of mint and something vaguely barnyard adjacent. A candle flickers beside you, and you hear scratching from the next bed over. Misery, it seems, loves company. But despite the discomfort, and there's something endearing about it all, the shared grooming, the passed-down remedies, the way even the most fastidious night is one bad comb day away from humble peasantry. In medieval HYGIENE, hair isn't just vanity. It's a battlefield. And tonight, you've survived another skirmish. The village square is unusually crowded this morning. Not for a market, not for a sermon, but for something far more thrilling: public humiliation. A wooden platform has been erected, and on it stands a man drenched in something unidentifiable. Probably sour ale. Possibly worse. A crier announces his crime: refusing to clean his household. Refuse, allowing filth to overflow into the alleyway. The punishment, a full hour in the stocks, With a side of rotting vegetables from the crowd, you sidle closer. Half curious, half horrified. Hygiene laws, it turns out, were more serious than they looked. While personal grooming was mostly private business, public cleanliness, or the lack thereof, could land you in very real trouble. Towns across Europe introduced regulations that required residents to clean the front of their homes, manage waste, and keep their pigs out of the road. Not doing so wasn't just rude, it was illegal. You overhear two older women gossiping about a neighbor who dumped her slop bucket too close to the church steps. Her punishment: sweeping the square every morning for a week under the watchful eye of the bailiff. Apparently, she also had to wear a sign that read, "Full of habit." You can't help but admire the poetic flair of medieval justice. Public shaming served as both hygiene enforcement and entertainment. The stocks, pillory, and sometimes even dunking stools were used to punish those who violated sanitary expectations. Historians still argue whether these measures truly improved public health or just made people better at hiding their messes. You walk past a narrow alley where a small group is gathered. A woman is being scolded by a town official for allowing her laundry water to flood into a neighbor's garden. The solution: she must publicly rinse her feet in the same water. Under the eyes of her fellow townspeople, it's both ritual and retribution, a community saying, "We saw what you did, and now you're going to live it." But it wasn't all punishment. Some towns offered small rewards, often bread or ale, for those who maintained exceptionally clean doorways or kept their animals properly tethered. A tidy yard could earn praise. A sloppy one, a fine. You watch as a local boy sweeps furiously in front of his family's cottage, probably hoping for a crust of barley bread and a rare nod from the reeve. The church had its own way of enforcing cleanliness, especially on holy days. One record you hear from a passing monk recounts a parishioner denied communion because his hands were visibly filthy. That seems harsh, until you remember this is the same era where some thought spiritual purity was linked to physical cleanliness. You wipe your hands on your tunic, just in case. Public bathhouses, while once common, had become rare in many towns by now. But their existence had rules. People were fined for behaving inappropriately or staying too long, especially if they dared bring food into the bath. Apparently, eating stewed eels while soaking with your neighbors was frowned upon. You chuckle and make a note to never mix lunch and lather. You find a town proclamation nailed to a wooden post. Its letters fading, but still legible. It bans the disposal of animal carcasses into public wells and forbids relieving oneself within 10 paces of the town gate. Enforcement is another matter. You turn to see a man hastily zipping up his breeches behind a hay cart. So close, punishment could escalate. Chronic offenders, especially butchers, dyers, or tanners who polluted local water supplies, faced heavy fines, confiscation of goods, or, in extreme cases, exile from the town. Being dirty wasn't just disgusting, it was civic sabotage. You imagine being exiled for bad laundry habits. Somehow, in this world, it makes sense. A local merchant tells you the tale of a soap maker who diluted his goods with chalk to save money. When caught, he was made to scrub the latrines with his own soap for 3 days, while barefoot. By the 3rd day, he smelled better than most of us. The merchant chuckles. Still, there were always loopholes. Wealthier citizens often hired dirt men to handle their messes. These men, usually from the fringes of town society, would clean privies, remove dead animals, and cart away human waste, often at night. They were essential yet reviled. You meet one at a tavern later that day, sipping weak ale and muttering that he knows the city better than the mayor. He probably does. You also learn about scolding stools, where women accused of gossip, unclean habits, or nagging filth were forced to sit in public for hours, wearing signs or even muzzles. It's as much about control as cleanliness. You realize hygiene as a tool for social discipline, and a way to pass an otherwise boring afternoon. As the crowd begins to thin, the man in the stocks is finally released. He stumbles off the platform, soaked, shivering, and likely humbler than he was an hour ago. A child throws one last cabbage leaf after him for good measure. The town crier folds up his scroll and announces that tomorrow's offender will be a pig farmer who let his herd wander into the baker's oven yard. People murmur excitedly, like they're planning to bring snacks. You walk back toward your lodging, reflecting on how cleanliness wasn't always a private matter. It was public, performative, and policed. People were punished not just for being dirty, but for letting others see it. In a world where survival depended on your reputation, even your chamber pot could get you into trouble. And as you remove your boots and brush the day's mud from your sleeves, you realize something else. Cleanliness here isn't just about hygiene. It's about belonging, about proving that you, too, I know how to keep your corner of the world a little less filthy. The morning sun slices through the fog like a blade, and with it comes the whirring sound of a grindstone and the deep, rhythmic thump of someone being very enthusiastically shaved. You've stumbled into the workshop of a barber surgeon, a man whose job description includes cutting hair, bloodletting, lancing boils, and, occasionally, removing an arrowhead from someone's backside. Welcome to the medieval spa experience. You won't be leaving relaxed. The shop is dark, full of dangling tools, mystery jars, and the distinct smell of iron, vinegar, and roasted leeches. A line has already formed, some for trims, others for treatment. You take a seat on a rickety bench between a man with a toothache and a woman clutching her elbow in a sling fashioned from her apron. A young assistant waves you forward and gestures to a chair that looks suspiciously like it's hosted more screams than conversations. You sit, and within seconds, the barber surgeon is behind you, snipping your hair with shears that double as poultry scissors. He hums as he works, possibly to distract you from the rusty bowl of blood at his feet. Haircuts were rarely about style. Clean-shaven faces and short hair were easier to maintain and, more importantly, reduced the risk of lice and other crawlies. For many, this was the closest thing to hygiene maintenance: scalp inspections, combings, and oil treatments, all done while sitting in a chair that smelled like boiled meat and old fear. But it's not just hair. The man next to you is here for a procedure: bloodletting. You watch as the barber ties a leather strap around his arm, selects a blade with alarming confidence, and opens a vein with the casual grace of someone slicing bread. The blood trickles into a bowl, cleansing the humors. The barber says cheerfully, "Too much black bile makes a man slow and surly." Bloodletting was the go-to medieval cure for just about everything: headaches, fevers, melancholy, even acne. Historians still argue whether it was ever truly effective or just a medically sanctioned way to make people woozy enough to stop complaining. You're offered a chance to try it. Just a small bleed to keep your spirits in balance. You politely decline, clutching your sleeve, and suddenly very aware of every vein in your body. Instead, you ask about dental hygiene. The barber smiles, revealing a suspiciously sparse collection of teeth, and says he also pulls them when they get rowdy. In the corner, a small boy is sharpening a tooth key, an instrument that looks like a corkscrew and is used to yank out teeth in the least delicate way imaginable. It was fast, brutal, and done in full view of an audience. You hear a tale about one barber who could extract 3 teeth in under a minute. He was known as Saint Molar, though you suspect the nickname wasn't meant kindly. The walls of the shop are decorated with herbs, dried flowers, and bottles of unmarked tinctures. You recognize some thyme, clove, garlic, and others that smell like they belong in a potion, not a prescription. These were used to treat skin conditions, ward off infections, or just make someone smell less like fermented onions. You try a paste of crushed mint and salt applied to your temples to balance the wind. It stings. A lot. But the barber insists it'll keep you from growing melancholy. You nod, even as tears prick your eyes. In another part of the room, a young girl sits with her foot in a basin of warm wine. She stepped on a splinter while walking barefoot through a stable. The barber is preparing to remove it with a curved blade and a chant that may or may not be medically approved. You decide not to watch. There's a curious item by the door, a jar of leeches. They're real, wriggling, and apparently quite popular among the higher classes. Leeches were believed to draw out bad blood and were applied to sensitive areas for maximum effect. A local lord, you're told, once had them attached behind his ears to treat persistent headaches. The headaches remained, but he gained a reputation for being well ventilated. The tools are terrifying. A trepanation drill for relieving pressure in the skull. Scissors shaped like bird beaks. Long iron needles for lancing abscesses. You touch none of them, and back away slowly. And yet, people keep coming, because the barber surgeon is affordable, accessible, and most importantly, somewhat effective. He offers relief, even if it's temporary or partly psychological. A haircut here isn't just grooming. It's reassurance that someone can do something about the chaos inside your body. By the time you leave, your hair is shorter. Your scalp smells faintly of rosemary and regret. And your appreciation for modern antiseptic has increased tenfold. Outside, a man with a cloth-wrapped jaw nods at you knowingly. You nod back. You've both seen things. As evening falls, you spot the red and white striped pole outside the shop, spinning slowly in the wind. It represents blood and bandages, a symbol of the barber's many talents. And you can't help but wonder how many people walked in for a trim and left lighter by a pint of blood and half a tooth. You settle onto a bench and lean back, your neck sore from holding still, your mind spinning from the smell of vinegar and steel. But at least your hair is no longer sticky with whatever that was from the bathhouse 2 days ago. Small wins, sharp razors, and an overwhelming desire to keep your hat on for the rest of the trip. The morning air carries the scent of old leather, sweat-soaked wool, and faintly, of something burnt, you've arrived at a military camp on the edge of a muddy road, where tents flap against rising gusts and armor clinks with every step. Welcome to the hygiene habits of a medieval army, where the only thing scarier than the battle is the smell of the barracks. You step around puddles that may be water, or worse. Soldiers trudge past you carrying buckets, bandages, or bundles of firewood. Some look half awake, others are wide-eyed, with that particular alertness you get from sharing a bedroll with a rat, and not the metaphorical kind. Washing here is minimal at best. There are no bathhouses, no warm basins scented with herbs, just a single barrel of water with floating leaves and a lineup of unenthusiastic men waiting to splash their faces and call it a day. You approach and dip a hand in freezing. That explains the grimaces. Soap is nowhere to be seen. Someone tosses a handful of sand into their palms and scrubs instead. Soldiers did what they could with what they had: rags, rain, or if lucky, a creek. The real luxury: clean socks. You meet a veteran who shows you his foot wraps. Strips of linen. He dries carefully every night by the fire. He swears it's the secret to avoiding rot. Judging by the man's intact toes, you believe him. Still, trench foot and open sores are common. The camp's medic, a guy named Bernard, who used to be a cooper, shows you a salve he mixes from goose fat, garlic, and moldy bread. It smells like crime, but it seems to help. You watch him wrap a soldier's blistered foot and gently remind him to keep it dry. The soldier laughs. It's been raining for 9 days. When it came to hygiene, armies lived by triage: patch what's bleeding, wipe what itches, and hope everything else waits until winter. Latrines were dug quickly and shallowly, sometimes covered with planks, other times just marked with a stick and a prayer. You're shown one such facility behind a row of tents. It's barely a trench, and the smell could peel the varnish off a lute. Historians still argue whether medieval armies had dedicated sanitation officers, or whether the job fell to whoever lost at dice that morning. Some records suggest attempts at organized waste management. But in practice, it depended on the commander. One knight insisted on a rotating latrine duty, another let his camp stew in its own filth, earning the nickname Sir Stinks-a-Lot behind his back. You can guess which army fared better during long campaigns. Bathing on the move was a fantasy. Water was too precious. If soldiers got a bath, it was often in a river shared. Of course, with horses, laundry, and someone's wounded leg. You witness a group of men knee-deep in a stream, passing around the same lump of soap like it's a sacred relic. One sings while scrubbing his armpits with moss. Another just dunks and hopes for the best. Clean clothes were rare, and when they did exist, they were worn sparingly to avoid using up the good smell. Undergarments were occasionally rinsed in wine or vinegar to kill lice. You meet a young archer who claims he keeps his shirt flea-free by burying it in dirt overnight. You raise an eyebrow. Bugs don't like soil, he explains confidently. You decide not to press the issue. In the officer's tent, things are marginally better. There's a basin of warmed water, a shaving kit, and a servant who boils linens with a handful of mint. The knight himself is being sponged down badly by a squire who looks like he'd rather be on latrine duty. The knight mutters that he'd kill for a proper bath. You think he'd probably kill anyway. But it's nice to know he has standards. You examine their armor, wondering how they kept that clean. The answer: they didn't. It rusted. It smelled. And under all that metal was padding soaked with layers of sweat, rain, and whatever they last stepped in. A soldier peels off his gambeson, a thick quilted jacket, and it audibly slaps against the bench. You take a step back. Wound care was even more precarious. Boil, lancing, arrow removal, and battlefield amputations were done with heated blades and a healthy disregard for sterilization. One camp surgeon shows you his tools blood-stained. Yes, but sharpened daily. He rinses them in strong alcohol before and after, which seems marginally better than the alternative. To deal with lice, soldiers shaved their heads or wore tight-fitting caps dusted with ash. Helmets didn't help, if anything. They baked everything underneath. You see a man scratch his scalp furiously, then set his helmet aside to let it air out. It smells like old soup. Despite the grime, soldiers were proud of their resilience. A veteran with a long scar and longer beard tells you, "You're not truly clean until you've survived a siege without washing once." He laughs. You don't. Yet, even amid the filth, moments of care emerge. A group gathers around a fire, boiling water for bandages. A squire patches a friend's cloak with thread he dyed using crushed berries. Another sharpens his sword, while a companion braids their hair tightly to keep it manageable. These quiet rituals, the tiny pockets of cleanliness and comfort, become sacred in a world soaked in blood and mud. As night falls and the camp begins to quiet, you watch soldiers curl into their cloaks, heads nestled against saddlebags or half-empty wineskins. The fires dim. The smoke thickens. The air hangs heavy with the scent of leather, iron, sweat, and victory, or at least survival. And as you lie down on a patch of moss, itching slightly, trying not to breathe too deeply, you realize something. In war, hygiene isn't just about looking presentable. It's about staying alive long enough to fight another day with both your sword and your nose intact. You awaken to the sound of groaning multiple groans. In fact, some low and rhythmic, others sharp and panicked. You're not in a battlefield camp anymore. This time, you've entered a medieval birthing chamber. The air is thick with heat, candle smoke, and the unmistakable tang of something iron-scented. You step carefully between women bustling to and fro, with bowls of steaming water and cloths stiff with repeated use. A baby is on the way. Cleanliness depends who you ask. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a community affair. Men were banned from the room, unless they were God or didn't mind fainting. Instead, the space is ruled by midwives and gossips, female friends and neighbors offering prayers, herbal tea, and lots of shouting. You stay close to the wall, trying to be invisible as a midwife barks orders to warm the birthing stool, fetch more towels, and steep yet another infusion of raspberry leaves. The birthing mother sits hunched, her forehead damp, one hand gripping a polished birthing talisman, the other clenching her shift until the seams groan louder than she does. A midwife wipes her brow with a cloth soaked in rosewater, not for comfort, but to clear the spirit. You wonder if spirits prefer lavender. Probably. You peer into the corner, where a kettle bubbles over a fire. Not tea. That's water boiled, then mixed with ale to disinfect cloths. Wine and beer were often cleaner than water in towns, and thus used liberally during childbirth for rinsing hands. Swabbing wounds. Or calming nerves. The mother's lips are damp with a tincture of chamomile and honeyed ale. She doesn't look soothed. Midwives were the unsung heroines of medieval hygiene. While doctors were off bleeding nobles and inspecting urine jars, midwives managed the messiest, riskiest business of all, bringing new life into an unsterilized world. They washed hands usually with vinegar or spirits. They boiled linens sometimes. They even trimmed umbilical cords with knives passed through flames. It wasn't sterile, but it was careful, seasoned, and surprisingly effective. Historians still argue whether midwives followed consistent cleanliness rituals or if practices varied wildly by region. Some evidence suggests that experienced midwives understood the importance of washing, ventilating the room, and isolating soiled linens. Others claim the process often involved more prayer than preparation. You glance at the midwife's kit, a pair of dull scissors, a wooden spoon, several cloths, and a carved charm shaped like Saint Plague, Margaret Patron, saint of childbirth, known for emerging from a dragon's stomach completely unharmed. You decide not to mention how relevant that feels right now. A girl hurries in carrying a bundle of herbs, lavender, mugwort, and sage tied with twine. She hangs it near the door to ward off evil spirits and bad smells, which were believed to be intimately related. According to miasma theory, bad air meant bad health, so medieval birthing rooms were often perfumed, not just for comfort, but protection. You're handed a rag and told to dampen it with the herb-infused water. You do, trying not to tremble, and gently place it near the birthing stool. The mother doesn't notice she's focused, sweat pouring down her cheeks as the baby finally crowns. With one last push, one shout that could shatter stained glass, the child arrives red-faced, squirming, and immediately loud. A healthy sound. The cord is cut. The baby is rubbed down with warm cloths, no baths yet, and swaddled tightly in linen. The mother is offered warm ale with a pinch of salt, and her legs are wiped clean with cloths that are soon whisked away to be boiled again or burned. You're not sure which. The room begins to settle. A hush falls as the newborn coos softly against its mother's chest. You see, even in this mess, this sweat-soaked miracle, there's an order, a ritual, a thread of logic behind every action. These women know what they're doing. You step outside into the cold, grateful for fresh air. But your reprieve is short-lived. A few doors down, a priest is administering last rites to a woman whose labor didn't end so well. Infant and maternal mortality were cruelly common, and even the best midwife couldn't fight a breech birth, infection, or a hemorrhage with just boiled herbs and prayers. Some believed that sin caused difficult labor. Others blamed curses, witches, or the position of the moon. One old woman swears by placing a cross made of bread above the doorway. Another recommends smearing goose fat on the knees. Science hadn't quite caught up, but superstition filled the gaps. Still, not all was guesswork. Some midwives kept records. Small books passed through generations, filled with recipes for soothing teas, birthing positions, and signs of danger. You glimpse one such book in a satchel, its pages worn and fragrant with dried rose petals. Later, as you sit by the hearth, cradling a cup of warm milk infused, of course, with sage, the new father enters. A looks descend, like he's seen a ghost, and perhaps he has. He asks if the baby's clean. You smile and nod. Clean, maybe not by your standards, but alive, warm, and swaddled. That's more than most could ask for in this world. Hygiene during childbirth isn't about sterility, it's about survival. Every rag rinsed in ale, every herbal pouch tied to the window, every whispered prayer and burnt cloth is part of a patchwork system stitched from tradition, desperation, and a whole lot of love. You pull your cloak tight and lean against the wall. Inside, a baby cries again, and someone starts to sing softly. It's not perfect. It's barely sanitary. But in the glow of that fire, and under the tired, tear-streaked faces of women who've done this too many times to count, it feels almost sacred. It's Sunday morning, and the village bells toll with the sleepy insistence of a rooster who thinks it's more important than it is. You trudge toward the small stone church, its doorway draped in ivy and the faint smell of beeswax. Today's topic isn't Mass, though it's the curious connection between hygiene and holiness, a concept that, in medieval times, often meant getting spiritually spotless, even if your fingernails were still full of cabbage dirt. You slip through the thick oak doors and are greeted by cool stone, the scent of incense, and the echo of whispered prayers. Parishioners file in slowly, faces scrubbed, garments pressed well, relatively, and hair smoothed down with either a damp cloth or spit, depending on who had time to boil water. It's a big day. They've bathed, mostly. Religious cleanliness was as much about symbolism as sanitation. The body, after all, was believed to be a vessel for the soul, and keeping it ritually clean was a sign of moral discipline. Not necessarily physically clean, but ritually, symbolically, spiritually presentable. You walk past a font of holy water and watch as an old man dips his fingers in and crosses himself. There's a soft splash. One child stares at the water with suspicion, possibly remembering it from last week's bath. Monasteries and convents had the most structured hygiene rituals. You observe a group of monks in a side chapel, washing their hands before prayer, murmuring Latin phrases as they scrub with cold water in a stone basin. This act ablution was required before meals, before Mass, before even touching sacred objects. Not for germs, for grace. Historians still argue whether these rituals helped prevent disease or if their benefits were purely spiritual. Some suggest the emphasis on hand-washing may have incidentally kept monks healthier than the general population. Others argue that once you've got one lice-ridden novice scratching behind his scapular, it's game over for the lot of them. Back in the pews, you sit beside a woman with a basket of lavender sprigs. She hands you one with a wink. For keeping the devil out of your bonnet, she says. You tuck it behind your ear just in case. Later, she tells you she soaks her undergarments in holy water during Lent. You nod solemnly, unsure whether to be impressed or deeply concerned. Baptism was the grandest of all religious hygiene rituals. You observe one in progress, a small, squirming infant dunked gently but firmly into a basin by a priest with a beard like a hedge. The baby howls. The priest mutters a prayer. The mother weeps. It's more than a ceremony. It's a full reset button for the soul. A cleansing that declares, this tiny human is now officially on the divine guest list. In some rural areas, women bathed before major feast days, Christmas, Easter, and the like, not just for social reasons, but because appearing dirty in church was seen as disrespectful. One record tells of a bishop who once refused a confession because the penitent smelled like turnips and old goat. Whether that's true or just a warning tale, whispered to stubborn children, you can't be sure. Pilgrims were also subject to hygiene rituals. Before entering a sacred shrine, they were sometimes required to wash their hands, faces, and feet. In certain abbeys, foot washing was even performed by monks as an act of humility. You watch this unfold in a nearby chapel. A line of travel-worn pilgrims remove their sandals and wait quietly as warm water is poured over their calloused feet. The monk, kneeling before them, scrubs gently, then dries each foot with a cloth marked with a cross. It's slow, deliberate, almost tender. You later hear a story about a king who built a bathhouse near a pilgrimage route, claiming that clean feet make for clean prayers. The bathhouse fell into ruin within a decade, but the quote lives on, scribbled in the margins of a dusty psalter, even during plague years. When fear outpaced understanding, religious cleanliness didn't disappear. Priests would sprinkle holy water on homes, sick beds, even livestock. You see a farmer hang a charm above his stable door, a small pouch containing a saint's medal, a splinter of yew, and a pinch of consecrated salt. It's meant to keep the animals healthy. You try not to notice that one of the cows is definitely sneezing. In Nonaris, personal purity was prized, but practical bathing was flexible. You peek into a convent washroom, where novices rinse their hands and faces in a common basin. No soap, but plenty of rose petals floating on top symbolism, with just enough aroma to hint at cleanliness. One nun gives you a knowing smile and confesses that she secretly boils her underclothes when the Mother Superior isn't watching. Heaven forgives little bubbles, she whispers. The link between dirt and sin was deep. Clean bodies meant clean minds. Filthy fingernails, probably a sign of spiritual decay. And yet, those same communities revered hermits, folks who hadn't bathed in decades, but were seen as closer to God. One particularly smelly saint, you're told, slept on a rock and never changed his robe, claiming the stench kept away temptation. You consider this and take an instinctive step away from your own clothes. You watch as the day's service ends, the congregation filing out, pausing to dip their fingers once more in the holy water, now grayer than it started. A child sneezes into his sleeve. Someone drops a hymn book into a puddle. It's a strange balance, this blend of reverence and regularity. A world where a ritual wash can cleanse the soul even if it doesn't quite get the grime from under your nails. As you leave the church, you spot a group of children chasing each other with rosemary branches. One claims it wards off sin. The other uses his as a pretend sword. Either way, someone's getting poked. Tonight, as you rinse your hands in tepid water that smells faintly of frankincense, you find yourself humming a hymn you didn't know you knew. It lingers on your tongue like honey and candle smoke. Maybe, in this time, to be clean isn't just to be scrubbed or perfumed. Maybe it's to feel, even for a moment, that you've stepped out of the muck and into the light. You're woken in the dead of night by something dripping. Slowly, rhythmically. Not rain. Not footsteps. Something stranger. You sit up, wrapped in your blanket, and realize it's coming from the corner of the room. Someone has hung a small satchel of butter soaked in herbs. And now it's melting into a bowl. On purpose, welcome to the wild world of medieval medical superstition, where the line between hygiene and hocus pocus is thinner than the patience of someone trying to clean a chamber pot with a thistle. You start the day with a visit to the local wise woman. She greets you from behind a wall of hanging dried plants, sage, rue, wormwood, and a few you don't recognize, but definitely don't trust. She offers you a protective wash made of vinegar, garlic, and the ash of last week's sermon notes. For luck, she whispers. You splash it on your face and smell like a salad possessed by the Holy Spirit. Medieval hygiene was often tangled up with magic, myth, and remedies passed down from someone's grandmother's goat. Cleanliness wasn't just about staying fresh, it was about keeping evil away. Disease was seen as punishment, imbalance, or if you were feeling particularly suspicious, a curse from a jealous neighbor. One man you meet insists on smearing sheep's butter inside his ears every new moon to prevent earworms. You try not to ask follow-up questions. Another woman hangs a piece of stale bread around her child's neck, claiming it pulls out the bad blood. The child looks unconvinced. So do you. Historians still argue whether these practices had roots in early medicine or were simply desperation with good branding. Either way, they were widely believed and practiced. You peek into a family's home and see rosemary and salt strewn in the doorway, not to welcome guests, but to repel disease, demons, and the baker's second cousin, apparently. You attend a village gathering where someone demonstrates the cleaning smoke, a ritual involving burning dried rosemary and swinging it around the house in a brass bowl. The smell clears the spirits. The man explains, then promptly coughs up a lung. You nod. Very spiritual. For those with skin conditions, remedies included snail slime, pig fat mixed with crushed rose petals, or a poultice of mashed leeks and sheep dung applied directly to the boil. You meet a shepherd who swears his hands are soft because of years spent mixing ointments with frog bile. He holds out a finger. You decline to shake it. Teeth, too, had their own superstitions. One woman ties a string around her wrist and chants a rhyme while brushing her teeth with ash and honey. It's said to prevent mouth ghosts. Whatever those are, you quietly do the same the next morning. Just in case, lice sure. They had solutions. You're offered a drink brewed from onion skins, vinegar, and duck feathers not to drink. Mind you, to rub on your scalp. It confuses them, someone explains, which seems fair. You try it. It works, in the sense that you are now confused and slightly flammable. You meet a priest who believes that bathing too often invites sin through the pores. Clean on the outside, open on the inside, he mutters. Meanwhile, a farmer claims his wife's annual bath is what keeps her alive. The wife does not appear pleased with this theory. There are written charms, too. You read one scratched onto a piece of parchment, stuffed under a bed, for warding off the sickness. Speak this thrice and spit eastward. It rhymes badly, but the intent is clear: cleanliness of the soul, if not the sheets. You come across a woman brushing her daughter's hair with a comb made from hazelwood, muttering under her breath with every stroke. She explains she's casting out ill breath before a feast. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, you decide not to ask. The daughter is silent, possibly resigned. In some towns, public bathhouses were once equipped with amulets hung above the doors to keep plague spirits from slipping in. When the baths were eventually shut down because of fears that steam opened the body to illness, those charms were taken home, where they hung in bedrooms, outhouses, or around the necks of people who hadn't washed since Lent. A carpenter shows you his charm belt strips of linen with herbs, pressed bones, and what might be a cat's tooth sewn in. Keeps my joints from rotting. He claims. His joints creak audibly as he sits. But hey, he's still walking. You join a supper where guests are offered clove-studded oranges to sniff between courses, to cleanse the breath, someone says. But you notice everyone starts sniffing a bit harder when the boiled cabbage arrives. Superstition. Maybe. Practicality wrapped in ritual. Definitely. And when death visits, which, let's be honest, it does frequently, ritual cleaning becomes even more vital. The body is washed with water, herbs, and prayers. Hands are folded just so, coins placed over eyes. The dead must be clean for the journey, even if the living aren't. You watch a washerwoman scrub a corpse's feet with wine-soaked cloth and hum a lullaby as she works. It's oddly peaceful. By nightfall, your body is sticky with herb oil, vinegar, and hope. You've rubbed your temples with garlic, whispered a charm to your shoes, and washed your hands in holy salt water. Do you feel clean? Not exactly. But you do feel shielded. Like maybe if the lice come tonight, they'll get confused by the bread necklace and the mint poultice on your forehead and just leave you alone. You curl up beneath a wool blanket that smells like goat, rosemary, and ambition, listening to a neighbor mutter a charm about clean dreams and unbitten ankles. And as you drift off, you realize sometimes hygiene isn't just about removing dirt. It's about believing you've done something to push back against the chaos. Even if that something involves butter in your ears. You wake up in a small, sunlit room that smells faintly of beeswax and oddly fermented pears. Your host for the day is already seated before a cracked hand mirror, dabbing a chalky white paste onto her face with a goose feather. Beauty, she sighs, takes sacrifice, judging by the clumps of hair on the comb beside her. You're inclined to believe her. Welcome to the dazzling, slightly toxic world of medieval beauty secrets, where hygiene, vanity, and questionable chemistry collide. She explains that her base paste is made from vinegar, white lead, and powdered bone. The lead gives her that perfect pale, death-adjacent glow that says, I haven't worked a day in my life, or I may be haunting this house. Historians still argue whether women truly understood the long-term effects of such ingredients, or simply ignored them for the sake of fashion. Either way, the look is both intentional and, quite literally, killer. Pale skin was a status symbol. It meant you weren't toiling in the sun like a commoner. Wealthy women went to great lengths to maintain their pallor, avoiding sunlight, wearing wide-brimmed veils, or even bleeding themselves lightly to drain the color. You watch in morbid fascination as your hostess dusts her neck with a powder of ground pearls and flour. You try not to sneeze. Next comes the rouge, carefully applied with a fingertip dipped in cochineal. A bright red dye made from crushed insects. It adds life to the cheeks and lips. She adds a tiny spot of it to her eyelids, too. For that wide-eyed, vaguely allergic look that was apparently on vogue. You're handed a small tin of the stuff and told to try it. You apply the barest dab and suddenly look like you're hiding a secret. Hair care, 2, is a ceremony. Your host's maid begins brushing her hair 100 strokes. Gently, while humming a hymn. Hair wasn't washed often, but it was perfumed, oiled, and braided. Religiously, women wore their hair long, but kept it bound, especially in public. Loosened hair was for private moments, spiritual ecstasy, or scandal. You help mix a rinse of vinegar, rosemary, and egg yolk. Heated until it smells exactly how you'd expect a medieval omelet for the scalp to smell. The mixture is massaged into the hair, then wrapped in a cloth and left to settle. You can practically hear the follicles praying. Some women bleached their hair with lye, lemon juice, or even urine, often sunbathing for hours, with their locks stretched over wooden frames. You observe a noblewoman perched on a windowsill, her golden hair slicked with bright water and wrapped in a silk net. She waves politely, blinking into the sun like a saint and a taxidermied owl, all at once. Eyebrows were a statement too ideally high, thin, or absent altogether. A plucked forehead gave the illusion of a larger frondent, more celestial brow. You see one woman use a heated cloth to soften the skin before plucking, then dab the area with rose water to reduce swelling. She winces and mutters something unholy every few seconds. You're introduced to a complexion water made from crushed violets, rose petals, and bits of silver leaf. It's meant to be dabbed on the face each morning with a soft cloth or a sponge carved from dried bread. The effect, slightly fragrant skin, with the lingering risk of a yeast infection. You dab your cheek out of politeness. One woman demonstrates her morning routine, which includes scraping her tongue with a wooden spatula, brushing her teeth with sage ash, and sniffing her armpits with the intensity of a wine connoisseur. Deodorants were rare, but perfumes were applied liberally to clothing, hair, and handkerchiefs. You're handed one embroidered with violets and cinnamon and instructed to wave it whenever someone unpleasant approaches. You wave it immediately. You also learn that some beauty remedies cross directly into the absurd. One woman insists that bathing in milk and honey prevents aging. Another claims, sleeping with a freshly laid egg under your pillow makes your skin glow with virtue. A merchant offers to sell you a pigeon blood mask for radiant cheeks, and the occasional vision. You pass in wealthier homes. Beauty products were imported from distant lands, coal from the east. Myrrh, saffron, even civet oil from, well, Tibet's. You're invited to sniff a tiny vial of perfume that smells like a flower having a midlife crisis. It's exotic. Yes. Pleasant, debatable. Men weren't immune to these rituals either. You meet a young courtier oiling his beard with a mixture of lavender and olive oil. He brushes it meticulously, then plucks a single gray hair with tweezers shaped like a tiny angel. "Disgrace," he says, glaring at the hair. He also applies a thin layer of scented powder to his underarms and a clove-studded sachet inside his doublet. Just in case, proximity leads to flirtation. You visit a traveling beauty seller's cart rows of tiny vials, powders, and creams laid out like a chemist's fever dream. She offers you a whitening cream made of sheep marrow and powdered marble. You decline. She nods sagely and hands you a violet lip stain instead. You apply a little and instantly taste regret. Despite all the strange ingredients and rituals, you sense a real desire behind it all, not just to impress, but to control. In a world full of uncertainty, sickness, and spiritual peril, looking beautiful was a way to assert order. A polished appearance might win a husband, earn respect, or simply keep you from being labeled a witch. Cleanliness, elegance, and supernatural protection applied in careful layers, one powder puff at a time. As night falls, you sit beside your host, both of you freshly painted, dusted, and oiled to a squeaky finish. The mirror reflects two slightly alarming versions of yourselves, glowing, fragrant, and vaguely edible. You laugh. She laughs. Somewhere in the corner, a mouse sneezes. Tonight, you'll sleep on a pillow filled with dried herbs to preserve your youthful glow. And maybe, just maybe, you'll dream in pastel. The next morning, you cross the cobbled town square as the smell of freshly baked bread mixes with something far more compelling: soap. Real, actual soap. Someone somewhere has boiled something. Your nose twitches. Curious, hopeful, and maybe a little suspicious. You follow the scent through the side streets, past the fishmonger and the crier bellowing about this week's plague signs, until you reach a low building with steam curling from its open shutters. Inside, you find a soap maker at work. He greets you with hands slick with lye and a smile that says he hasn't quite lost all sensation in his fingertips. "You're just in time," he says, gesturing to a bubbling cauldron of fat, ash, and rainwater. The future smells faintly of goat. You nod gravely. Soap making, it turns out, is part alchemy, part animal byproduct, and 100% commitment. Medieval soap wasn't the sweet-scented rainbow cube you might know today. It was grayish, gritty, and smelled like whatever you had lying around, usually beef tallow, pig fat, or leftover cooking grease. The fat was boiled with lye, which was made by leaching water through ash, until it thickened into a paste. Then it was cooled, cut, and left to harden on shelves beside the bread. Hopefully not swapped by mistake. You're handed a fresh bar to try. It feels like a brick and smells like rosemary, smoke, and determination. You wash your hands in a wooden basin, and for once, in this journey, you feel genuinely cleaner. The bar leaves a faint sting, an unfortunate side effect of improperly measured lye, but it's a small price for the sensation of actual suds. Historically, soap fell in and out of favor. In early medieval times, it was common in parts of the Islamic world and even among some European monastic communities. But later, especially in the West, it became more associated with laundry than personal care. Historians still argue whether this was due to cost. superstition, or simply the unpleasant smell of most early soaps by the later Middle Ages. However, change was bubbling literally. Soap production centers emerged in places like Marseille, Castile, and Naples. These were cities with access to good olive oil, clean water, and enough economic sense to turn cleanliness into commerce. You meet a trader who boasts that his family imports Castilian soap made with olive oil and no animal fat, favored by queens and bishops alike. He gives you a sample. It's smooth, creamy, and smells like something you could eat if your standards were lower. The shift toward modern cleanliness didn't happen overnight, but gradually, bathing began to resurface as a healthy, even fashionable, activity. You hear whispers of Renaissance courts where entire bathing suites were built complete with heated floors, scented towels, and fountains that burbled like stage props in a very clean dream. Nobles began to own their own soap. Merchants sold scented oils and imported soaps in ornate containers. Cleanliness began to mean status again, not just superstition. You visit a wealthy household where a servant boils linen napkins in soap and rosemary. The mistress explains that her underclothes are laundered weekly and that she bathes once a month, whether she needs it or not. Cleanliness is next to elegance. She insists, adjusting a sleeve with embroidered lemons. You nod politely, though she's still wearing the same wool gown from yesterday. Later that afternoon, you wander into a new kind of establishment, a private bath chamber in the city, recently restored by a wealthy guild. It's tiled, filled with warm water, and lined with small pots of soap and oils. A physician oversees the whole affair, muttering about humors and balance while handing out instructions on bath timing. You're submerged up to your chin in hot, scented water. Before you can even ask about prices, you lean back. You breathe, for the first time in days, maybe weeks. You don't itch. As you soak, others come and go: merchants, cholars, even a friar who insists the water is good for divine alignment. Someone nearby is using a curved metal tool to scrape oil and dirt from their arms in the old Roman fashion. Another is rubbing crushed bay leaves into their scalp. The room hums with quiet pleasure and the occasional yelp when someone steps on a hot tile. A young boy walks through offering towels, and the physician announces that soap use must be followed by a cooling rinse. You oublie, stepping into a secondary chamber where cooler water flows from a copper spout. The shock to your system is dramatic, but your skin tingles afterward, and you feel miracle of miracles refreshed. As the day ends, you're invited to a dinner hosted by the soap maker. The table is simple bread, cheese, dried fruit, but everyone has clean hands, clean collars, and vaguely shiny faces. One guest hands you a slice of lemon to rub on your fingers after the meal, to cut the grease. You do. It works. And as the candles burn low and the conversation drifts toward things like imported saffron and whether washing hair too often weakens the scalp, you realize something shifted. Hygiene is no longer just about superstition or punishment, or covering things up with herbs. It's becoming desirable, a lifestyle, a mark of wealth, health, and perhaps, dare we say, progress. You walk home through quiet streets where the gutters run clear with the day's wash water. Soap is still expensive, still pungent, is still sometimes suspect, but it's spreading. In recipes, in trade, in whispered suggestions that maybe, just maybe, being clean isn't unholy after all. The rain is gentle tonight. More mist than storm, pattering softly against the wooden eaves as you step into a modest cottage lit by rushlights and the low glow of embers. You're back where you began, in the realm of the everyday, surrounded by peasants, hearth, warmth, and the quiet rituals that define real life. But something is different. There's a bowl of warm water by the door, a clean rag, a bar of soap, small, grittu, and precious, resting on a wooden plate like a prize. You've spent days walking through castles, cloisters, bathhouses, and battlefield latrines. You've been powdered, perfumed, scraped, and sponged. And now, as you sit cross-legged by the fire, a young girl offers you a simple cloth. No fanfare, no superstition, just a square of linen and a moment to clean your face. You accept with thanks. This household isn't wealthy. The father returns from the fields with mud on his boots and a line of sweat tracing through the dirt on his brow. But before dinner, he washes face, hands, and neck in the same basin everyone shares. The youngest fetches a ladle of warm water from the pot above the fire and adds it to the bowl with the solemnity of a priest mixing communion wine. Cleanliness here is small, sacred, and shared. You watch the mother scrub a wooden spoon with ash paste and a handful of straw. Rinse it carefully, then set it near the fire to dry. She inspects her work with a kind of pride. Clean tools means safe food. Safe food means another day without a fever. A neighbor stops by to share news a cousin's child has survived a fever after a midwife insisted on daily cloth washes with wine vinegar. Witchcraft. Someone jokes, but no one's laughing too hard. It worked. After all, you're handed a warm cloth for your feet and realize that this, more than perfumed baths or courtly rituals, is the heart of hygiene community care. Here, people clean not because of shame or punishment, but because they're looking out for one another. Clean linens mean fewer infections. Brushed hair keeps lice from spreading. Washing your hands before meals keeps your children safe. As the stew bubbles and the windows fog with hearth heat, the family's older daughter begins brushing her sister's hair by candlelight. The strokes are slow and rhythmic, and you remember that same gesture from the monastery, the soldier's camp, even the noblewoman's chamber. Always the brush, always the care. It's the unchanging ritual of order in a world that never stays still. You hear again about the wise woman in the next village who insists on bathing every equinox. Not for magic, she says. Just because the body gets tired of being ignored. Her practices, herbs, oils, rinses are catching on. A few other homes now store soaproot in clay jars. Not many, but enough to notice. Historians today look back and wonder whether medieval people cared about hygiene at all. But you've seen it, they cared in the ways they knew how. They improvised, repurposed, copied, and clung to what worked. A sprig of rosemary and a collar, a bucket of water in the sun, a whispered prayer over a clean rag. Little gesture is often flawed, sometimes funny, but deeply human. You ask the mother where she learned to wash linen with lavender and beer. My grandmother, she says, and her grandmother before that. We've always done it this way. Then she pauses, shrugs. It smells nicer than ditch water. And that's the slow truth of it. Change doesn't arrive like thunder. It creeps in with soap made of goat, fat, and ash. It arrives on the hems of boiled linens. It hides in the steam, rising from a warm rag held to a child's cheek. Over generations. What was once superstition becomes custom. What was once ritual becomes reason, later. As you stretch out beneath a patchwork of clean-smelling blankets, you hear rain tapping the roof and the low coo of a hen roosting beside the hearth. Someone sneezes. A dog scratches. But the air is clear. The water is warm. And the floor has been swept just enough to feel like care. And in this simple home, where soap is a treasure and bathing is a luxury, you feel something unfamiliar settle over you. Not cleanliness. Exactly. But comfort. A quiet, well-earned peace. You close your eyes. Tomorrow, the fire will need stoking. The water will be cold again. The soap will chip into crumbs. But tonight, in this room, you are clean enough. Morning breaks softly. No rooster. No shouting in the streets. No banging pots, just the low creak of wooden beams stretching in the warmth of sunlight. You open your eyes slowly. Your skin, for once, doesn't itch. Your breath doesn't fog the air. And best of all, your clothes, aired out beside the hearth overnight. I don't smell like onions in Battlefield. At least, not entirely. You rise slowly. Your body still heavy from days of walking. Scrubbing. Steeping. Scraping. And learning. You dip your hands into the now cold basin from the night before. It smells faintly of rosemary and ashes cleanliness, by medieval standards. Almost spa-like by yours. You pat your cheeks dry and take a moment to notice the small but important things: clean fingernails, a combed beard, socks that don't stand on their own. Progress. Outside, the town moves at its usual unhurried pace. The baker's fire is already lit. A woman sweeps the steps of the tavern with a bundle of hazel twigs. Down the lane, a boy hauls a bucket of gray water toward a garden, careful not to spill it near the well. These are the new rhythms, the daily habits that carry faint echoes of a cleaner future. You pass a monk with sandaled feet and a flask of perfumed oil tucked into his robes. For the feet of the weary, he says, offering you a drop. It smells like thyme and a hint of lemon. You smile and rub it between your fingers. His nod is slow, knowing. Even the devout understand that care for the body can elevate the spirit. A merchant unfurls bolts of cloth in the market and pauses to spritz them with rosewater. It's a selling trick. Yes, but also a quiet nod to the future. Buyers sniff appreciatively, not because they're judging cleanliness, but because they've come to expect it. Clean is catching on. A group of young girls sit on the edge of a fountain, sharing a hunk of bread and a pot of something called skin cream. It's beeswax, olive oil, and a bit of powdered mint. They take turns dabbing it on their elbows, laughing as they do. A century ago, they might have been sprinkling dirt to ward off demons. Now they're moisturizing. Evolution happens in soft steps. You visit the soap maker one last time. He's stirring a new batch this time with lavender and bay leaf. It's what the apothecary requested. He says, supposed to lift the vapors. He pauses. But truthfully, people just like the smell. Later, you find a town notice nailed to a post near the square. It's a new ordinance. All butchers must clean their stalls weekly. All laundry must be done outside the city walls. And no more emptying chamber pots near the cathedral steps. A man beside you reads aloud and mutters, "About time." You nod. It's slow, but it's something. At the edge of town, you climb a hill where the wind is clean, and the view shows rooftops stretching into the haze. From here, you can almost see the path you've taken, bathhouses, long closed. Rivers where laundry flapped in the wind. Castles, reeking of mold and pride. Fields where soldiers scrubbed with sand and shame. And quiet homes where mothers wiped dirt from their children's faces with loving hands and cloths soaked in warm ale. You sit on a flat stone, letting the breeze play with the hem of your cloak. And you reflect. Hygiene in the medieval world was never simple. It was tangled in superstition, shaped by scarcity, whispered between neighbors, passed down like a half-remembered prayer. It was sometimes about health, often about status, always about survival. And while it wasn't always effective by modern standards, there were lice, plagues, pits, and more. You saw the effort, the tiny rituals, the quiet dignity, the belief that even in the dirtiest world, someone might take the time to wash a bowl, scrub a floor, or perfume their sleeves. And slowly, those efforts added up. From monasteries to marketplaces, battlefields to bathhouses, a slow shift began. Toward soap, toward rinsing, toward bathing for health. Not just holidays. You were there for the change. You smelled it. You scratched through it. You survived it. Now, as the sun drifts lower and the clouds blur pink against the horizon, you take one last deep breath. You smell smoke and herbs, and maybe, just maybe, the faintest whiff of civility. You make your way back into town, slipping through quiet alleys and lamplit corners. The world hums with the familiar rhythms, pots boiling, cloths drying, someone brushing their teeth with a stick and a prayer. You pull your blanket around your shoulders, your skin still tingling from the morning's final rinse, and as the doors close and the firelight softens the room, you lie down on a cot that smells like sun-dried linen and thyme. You've earned your rest, not just for walking miles in another time, but for seeing the humanity in a history we so often reduce to dirt and plague. You are clean. You are warm. And for the first time, in a very long time, you can fall asleep without worrying what might crawl across your chest. So now, tucked beneath your blanket, safe and warm, let your mind drift away from medieval chamber pots and vinegar rinses. Let go of the itch, the smell, the endless scrubbing. You've walked through every alley, stepped across every rush-strewn floor, ducked under every hanging bundle of herbs. You've washed with wine, dried with straw, and soaked beside strangers in steam that smelled like stew and thyme. And now none of that matters, because this is the moment where the fires burn low. The last candle flickers on the mantle. Somewhere far off, a donkey brays once, then kiets. The village sleeps, even the lice. You hope. Are dreaming. Your limbs sink into softness. Your breath slows. The rustling of straw outside the cottage blends with the hush of your own thoughts. No more scratching. No more washing. No more strange butter in stranger places. Just silence. Warmth. And stillness. Feel the cool fabric on your cheek. The gentle rhythm of your chest rising and falling. Let that rhythm carry you. Let the soft hum of the past become background noise. Let it fade like footsteps in a fog. You're not in a medieval cottage anymore. You're floating. You're drifting. You're done. Sweet dreams.